Alright, so here we are testing Call of Duty Black Ops 6 with the RTX 4070, and today we're pairing that with the 14600K of CPU and 32GB of DDR5, 6400 megatransfers per second CL32 memory. All the specs were up on the screen right there, and I'm just going to be testing a little bit in the campaign. This is just the first mission, and then we will test some multiplayer, and we'll just go through a bit of the settings here. Alright, so currently we're at 1080p on the extreme preset, and we're not hitting 100 frames per second. I'm on fire. I did test the game a little bit. It's actually got all the upscaling technologies that you want. For some reason they even included FSR1, maybe for people with the very old GPUs that don't support the latest versions of FSR. It's got XeSS and then DLSS, the usual, and then it also has FSR 3.1 frame generation, which is great because that FSR 3.1 frame generation works on pretty much all GPUs, right? So it actually makes a big difference in this game as well as it does upscaling. And as you can see here, our average was around 104 frames per second. Our 1% lows are quite low at 68, and our 0.2% lows are sitting at 59. So let me just change this down to DLSS quality. So just to show you the settings here, we are using the RTX 4070, and then I'm using an external capture card for all my recordings. And if we go down here, we're at extreme. So if you want to enable DLSS, you have to select DLSS there, obviously, but then you have to click show more, and then you can select the preset. So if we go with DLSS quality, remember we were getting around 100 frames per second. And now with DLSS quality, we are getting 166 frames per second. So upscaling really works quite well in this title. It helps quite a lot. Actually, at 1440p, in some places I saw that it actually doubled my frame rate for some reason. So oh, that's my teammate. So I'm not 100% convinced that using 1080 or using DLSS at 1080p is the best way to play this game. You can enable frame generation in the single player modes because the input latency won't really bother you that much. It doesn't bother me that much anyway, but for multiplayer games I would try and stay away from frame generation if possible. But speaking of frame generation, I'm just going to restart the mission, and then I'm going to enable FSR 3.1 frame generation. Alright, so we're back here with FSR 3.1 frame generation enabled, still on the extreme preset 1080p with DLSS set to quality, and now we are getting around 230 frames per second. Previously we were getting around 150 frames per second, so FSR frame generation helps quite a lot at 250 frames per second there for a few seconds. It helps quite a lot. You can see the frame time graph is a lot smoother. Our lows are much higher, and this is why I do love frame generation. It does not give you the high refresh rate experience when it comes to input latency, but it does give you the high motion fluidity that comes with the high refresh rate experience, right? And the motion fluidity is it's pretty good at 240-ish frames per second here, and this is on the extreme preset, as I said. If we drop this down to the balance preset, maybe we might get 300 frames per second, which seems to be the engine limit for this game. I could not adjust it above 300 frames per second in the menu. We'll see if we can hit that, but I think this is actually a pretty good experience. Even with DLSS set to quality at 1080p, the game looks plenty good, and the input latency at this higher frame rate really is not noticeable at all. Not to me anyway. Alright, so once again, I'm just going to be playing this small starting sequence here, just not to give anything away when it comes to the campaign, and then we'll test some multiplayer as well. But I'm going to restart the mission again, and let's just drop this down to I think there's a quality preset just below extreme. So let's try the quality preset, see if there's a bit of a difference. Just a spoiler alert, there's really not that big a difference in my previous testing, but we'll test it anyway. Alright, so here we are back with the ultra preset, and we gained around, I'd say around 20 frames per second, give or take. Remember, we were just below 100 frames per second actually when we got to that point over there. So let's see what the frame rate there looks like. But I think we gain around 20 frames per second going from extreme to ultra. maybe not even, right? We are just above 100 frames per second here, where we previously were just below 100 frames per second. So not that big a difference between the Ultra and the Extreme preset. But if you do want just a slightly higher frame rate and not that big an impact to your visuals, then the Ultra preset is something to consider. Although I know, I mean, I'm not a pro Call of Duty player at all. I think it's quite obvious, but and I do know that the guys that play this game quite frequently, they like to manually tune their settings. I'm just here to test presets, but if you do tune your settings to your liking, I'm pretty sure you'll get a much better experience when it comes to the frame rate anyway. Right, so our loads was actually quite a bit better than on the Extreme preset. You can see they're sitting at 88 and 83 frames per second respectively, and our average is sitting at 112, so yeah, around 20 frames per second increase, right? So let's see, I'm going to enable DLSS quality once again, and then we'll test FSR frame generation. Then I'm going to see if I can actually hit 300 frames per second engine limit. Right, so I'm just enabling DLSS quality on the Ultra preset here still, and if we go back to our game, we're still not CPU bound, right? Which is quite impressive, seeing that we are pushing almost 100, let me just reset the numbers, almost 180 frames per second here, and yet we are not CPU bound. This is actually pretty good. You can see our GPU usage is sitting at 100% usage, and our CPU is sitting at around 50%, and it's, I mean, it's chilling there at 50 degrees Celsius. It's not cold here, it's pretty warm here in South Africa this time of year. Anyway, 171, 172 frames per second average there, 1% low sitting at 132, and our 0.2% low sitting at 125. I'm going to be standing still in this specific spot, enable frame generation. Let's see how high we can actually push this frame rate. All right, so FSR 3 frame generation is enabled. And let's see, 265. Let me reset the numbers again. I'm just going to be running around here in this specific spot. I'm not going to be doing the whole test from scratch again. So we're not hitting that 300 frames per second engine limit yet. 272. I think on the balance preset we should be able to 301. There we go. All right, so I think well, it's going above 300, 341. In the menu, it said that the frame rate limit in-game is 300. So, okay, that's actually quite interesting. Here I was aiming for a limit that did not exist. All right, so 284 frames per second. This is actually a pretty good experience. The input latency is definitely not noticeable at almost 300 frames per second here. All right, I think that's enough for the 1080p testing. Let's move on to 1440p. All right, so yeah, we are at 1440p. Just restarted the mission again, and our frame rate took quite a big hit, but our visuals improved significantly. It actually looks plenty good. Now, I'm actually curious whether it'll drop below 60 frames per second at times, because we're not in the most demanding section, yeah. Now, just once again, I'm just testing this specific spot. It might be more demanding later on in the game. It might be less demanding. I don't know. It's just, I think there's a lot happening here with the smoke effects, etc. So I think it might be a good testing scenario, and also not trying to give anything away when it comes to the story. So 69 frames per second, they're nice, and I mean, we did not drop below 60. We saw 61 there for a second, so pretty close. It might drop below 60 frames per second sometimes. Alright, so 69 frames per second average. There are 1% low sitting at 50, and our 0.2% low sitting at 45. Now, this is once again on the Extreme preset. So let's see what the DLSS can do here for us. Alright, so just DLSS set to quality, still on the Extreme preset, and let's go ahead and apply that. And if we go back into our game, this is actually, I mean, we almost doubled our frame rate. We went from just over 60 frames per second to just under 120 frames per second. So DLSS definitely helps quite a lot here, and I'd be happy playing the game with these settings, even on the Extreme preset, just with DLSS set to quality. I mean, the visuals, the difference in visuals, it's pretty indistinguishable, right? The DLSS versus DLAA at this resolution. I think you'd be hard pressed unless you do a side-by-side comparison, zooming in 3 times and slowing down 5 times, etc. I think it'll be hard to see the differences here. All right, so 119 frames per second average. There are 1% lows, not that great at 75. At least there's not a lot of stuttering, right? the game does have a shader compilation step when you start it, and our 0.2% lows are sitting at 53. So I'm going to enable FSR 3 frame generation, see if I can actually max out my 165 Hz panel by using that. Alright, so FSR 3 frame generation is enabled, and we are almost getting 200 frames per second. Now, as I said, the input latency is really not noticeable at all at these higher frame rates, and getting almost 200 frames per second here. But still, I personally would not use this in multiplayer. Alright, just because there might be some visual anomalies and the input latency might affect some people. There are definitely people that are more sensitive to the input latency of frame generation, or the additional input latency of frame generation. And I mean, that's just my personal opinion, or my personal choice not to use frame generation in multiplayer games where accuracy and response times make a difference. So, or actually better. So 183 frames per second here, our 1% layers are sitting at 147, and our 0.2% layers are sitting at 140. So actually very, very good. If you want to clean up the smoothness of the game, then FSR frame generation helps a lot with that. This is actually a pretty good FSR 3 3.1 implementation, I'd say. There's really no visual anomalies that I can pick up, and really no frame time graph issues either, so that's actually pretty good. So I'm just going to start the benchmark run from here again, not going to restart the mission, but let's drop this down to the quality preset, and then we'll test balanced as well. Sorry, not quality, ultra. All right, so the ultra preset is the one just below extreme. So we'll just be using DLAA, no frame generation. Let's go ahead and apply that. Right, so over here we were below 70, or let's call it around 70, 65 frames per second previously on the extreme preset, and now we are sitting at 80, between 70 and 80 frames per second going through the smoke here, 70, well, the low 70s. So once again, not that big a difference between the ultra preset and the extreme preset. Still, if you're struggling to maintain 60 frames per second, then you can just drop this down to the ultra preset. Although I'd just use the DLSS quality, especially on the RTX 4070, which has 12 gigabytes of VRAM. The game is not that heavy on VRAM. You can see we are using around 8 gigabytes of VRAM used. So 81 frames per second here, not terrible. Our lows are pretty decent as well. So I do think that the lows are impacted quite a bit by using the extreme preset. So that is something to consider. Right, so our 1% low is sitting at 69, and our 0.2% low is sitting at 67. Now, I do not have 0.1% lows on CapFrame X because the on-screen display does not have that, unfortunately. But I'm using CapFrame X because it does have the GPU busy average and frame time deviation, etc. Right, so that indicates a CPU bottleneck. If you look at our GPU busy deviation, it's sitting at 3%. That means that we are 3% CPU bound, right? Or CPU bottlenecked. All right, so really not a lot. Anyway, let's try DLSS quality and then FSR, and then we'll drop down to the balance preset. All right, so just DLSS quality, no frame generation. And I just want to see if we double our frame rate again. Almost. We were just at around 80 frames per second, right? And now we are at around 140 frames per second. DLSS actually helps quite a lot here. And I'm assuming that FSR would too. And also, one other thing, AMD GPUs actually perform quite a bit better with the Call of Duty engine for some reason. Just if you have a look at something like the 7800 XT versus the 4070, the 7800 XT should perform around 10% better. That's just basically what happened with all the previous Call of Duty games. So I'd be surprised if that's not the case here. I think they all use the same engine. Right, so 135 frames per second here using DLSS quality on the Ultra preset, actually pretty good. The input latency is very responsive, which is what you'd like to see. Our 1% low sitting at 106 and our 0.2% low sitting at 101. Very, very decent experience here. So I'm going to see if we can hit 200 frames per second here. Just going to stand still here and enable frame generation. Seeing we're getting 135 frames per second here. All right, and we hit 200 frames per second here just by enabling FSR 3 frame generation. Once again, the input latency is perfectly fine at this high frame rate, and maintaining almost 200 frames per second is pretty good. Now, once again, as I said, I'd probably play on the extreme preset myself, but if you want to save a little bit of power, you can maybe just use this and cap your frame rate to like 165 frames per second, which would be the max of my 1440p panel anyway, and then you'd be using around 160 watt on the GPU instead of around 200 watt. That's what I saw in my previous testing. So there are ways to use frame generation instead of just increasing the frame rate, but then also just remember that the lower your frame rate, the higher the input latency would be. Right, I know this is just a boring run, but I just want to show you the frame rate here and not spoil anything, as I said before. So an average here of 197 frames per second, our 1% low sitting at 152, and our 0.2% low sitting at 151. This is actually pretty good. Now I'm going to once again just stand still here. I'm not going to do a whole run here. I'm going to drop down to the balance preset quick. All right, so the balance preset, Nvidia DLAA. So this is native resolution using DLSS's anti-aliasing, right? So it's deep blend anti-aliasing and no frame generation. So DLAA just cleans up the image quite a bit, and it does have a slight performance cost, but not much. And here we are getting almost 100 frames per second average, depending on where we are going, right? So looking this way, I think if you're aiming for 100 frames per second, the balance preset is pretty good. This is probably where I'd play the multiplayer maps, just adjust some settings anyway with regards to view distance and shadows, etc. You know what these people do to cater for their own experiences. It's to try and see enemies a little bit better. Play on low settings except for view distance or whatever. So we are getting an average of 100 frames per second, our 1% low sitting at 80, and our 0.2% low sitting at 71. I'm not going to run around this time changing to DLSS. I just want to see what the difference in the frame rate is by enabling DLSS quality here quickly. And let's see, 150-ish frames per second. Let's just reset the numbers, see if it stays like that. So 150 frames per second using DLSS quality. And then if we go ahead and enable frame generation quickly, and let's just get rid of that. All right, so DLSS set to quality and then FSR frame generation enabled. And this is on the balance preset. So let's just see, it takes a while for frame generation to kick in. 180, 220-ish frames per second, right? So we gained around 10% going from ultra to balanced. We were around 200 frames per second previously, right, on the ultra preset using these exact same settings. So if you do have a 240 hertz panel, settings to consider, I think this game would actually be pretty great on a 240 hertz OLED panel. Unfortunately, OLED panels here in South Africa are very, very expensive, so I'm still stuck on an IPS panel. Anyway, so 223 frames per second average here, very, very decent. And our 1% lows are sitting at 172, and our 0.2% lows sitting at 157. Now, the reason why I keep on reading out the numbers is because some people watch this on phones and they can't really see the numbers, so just informing them about them. All right, so this is actually a pretty decent experience here. You can see our GPU busy deviation sitting at 0%. That's actually what frame generation helps with quite a lot, as well as when you are CPU bound, it can help alleviate a CPU bottleneck. Anyway, so let's move this over to 4K. All right, so I just restarted the campaign, and this is rough going. We are at around 40 frames per second, and this is not how I would personally like to play Call of Duty. Now, the visuals look extremely good. This is my capture card is connected to a 4K monitor, right? So it now being at native 4K, it really looks very, very good, but the performance is definitely lacking, right? So 36 frames per second. Yeah, let's just see. I'm going to see what the DLSS can do here for us. Maybe I'm going to try and aim for at least 60 frames per second here. I'm not going to be testing too much at 4K, I think. So let's just try DLSS quality, and then we'll do frame generation as well, and then we'll do maybe just the balance preset. All right, so we are seeing 60-ish frames per second here, which is which is good enough, right? Obviously, for a shooter, I'd personally want slightly higher frame rates just for motion fluidity and responsiveness, input latency, that kind of thing. It would be more ideal to have a higher frame rate, obviously, and but that's not terrible. It looks good, it runs well enough, and I mean, with DLSS set to quality, it really does look great at 4K output. So let me just see. I want to kill all these guys. I think that's it. So 60-ish frames per second. Now, people always ask me why don't I test frame generation at native resolutions, and it's because you'd want the highest base frame rate as possible before enabling frame generation due to the input latency. Now, that's why I don't test frame generation at native resolutions. I always enable DLSS, at least on quality, to try and get above 60 frames per second, and then I enable frame generation, which is exactly what we're going to do now, because we are above 60 frames per second. There we were seeing around 70-ish frames per second. So let's go ahead and just enable FSR frame generation. It should probably take us above 100 frames per second here, although the input latency would probably be a little bit more noticeable. Sorry about the black screens there. And now it changed to, it's no longer full screen. I mean, it says full screen exclusive, but it's no longer full screen exclusive. All right, so here we are. Extreme preset, DLSS set to quality, and FSR frame generation enabled. And around 110, between 100 and 120 frames per second. Input latency is noticeable now. Compared to previously, it's definitely a lot more noticeable, but the visuals really look great. Game at 4K, like it's really not a bad looking game. Even the previous Call of Duty games, I know that they churn these out at least once a year, and it's remakes, and it's the same thing over and over and over again, but it does look good. This one specifically looks quite good, and using these settings, DLSS set to quality with FSR frame generation, I'd be okay playing this game like this campaign, not multiplayer, but campaign definitely would be okay. All right, so 104 frames per second here. I'm going to just disable frame generation, drop down to the balance preset, and leave DLSS quality enabled, and then we'll do the same test with FSR frame generation, and then we'll just do 1 or 2 tests in the multiplayer map. All right, so the reason why I'm not testing the balance preset at native is because we are not able to hit 60 frames per second. We have to drop down to the basic preset to get around 60 frames per second, so which is not ideal. So the balance preset here with DLSS set to quality getting us around 80 to 90 frames per second, and I do think if we enable frame generation now, we should be able to get around 130-ish frames per second, which would be pretty good for a 120 hertz display, right? So an average here of 88 frames per second. Our 1% lows are sitting at 75, and our 0.2% lows sitting at 73, and pretty good experience. All right, let's enable frame generation. All right, so FSR 3.1 frame generation is enabled, and we are getting around 120 frames per second pretty consistently. I'd say it should stay above 110 frames per second at all times, right? Specifically in this map, I think. As I said, I'm not entirely sure what'll happen further along in the campaign. Maybe there are more demanding areas, but this is just to give you an idea of what the performance would be like. And dropping just below 120 frames per second there. So this is actually pretty decent, and even though we only gained around 10-15 frames per second compared to the previous settings we used, the input latency is definitely much improved. It really feels pretty good, and I'd be able to play like this the campaign and no problem whatsoever. All right, so I think that's going to be it for our campaign testing. Let's just test 1 or 2 settings. I'm not going to be testing all the settings again on the campaign. I just want to see if the performance in the multiplayer, sorry, not campaign. I just want to see if the performance in multiplayer is more or less relatable to the campaign, and if it is, then I mean, we don't have to rerun all the benchmarks. All right, so let's drop into a multiplayer match. Don't laugh at my gameplay. I don't play these games competitively at all. All right, so here we are in kill order, and I'm supposed to be the HVT. I'm guessing it's high value target, so these people should protect me. And 1440p on the extreme preset, we are seeing a much higher frame rate than previously in the campaign. I guess it makes sense because the visuals are definitely, or the maps are much smaller. And as I said, I do suck in this game. I don't think there are respawns. Is there? I really hope there is, because I would really like to complete my benchmark. Ah, there is. All right, so okay. That did not help me at all. Okay, so... Okay, alright, so we're safe. So 130-ish frames per second here on the extreme preset, actually pretty good. Although I'd personally want a little bit of a higher frame rate, trying to max out my panel here. And it's really difficult to try and benchmark while staying competitive. As I said, I really do suck. Right, so 124 frames per second there. And let's just see if we can change the graphical settings quickly enough. So let's just drop this down with using DLSS quality, sorry, DLSS and then quality. All right, and there we have it, 169 frames per second, 200 frames per second. And I'm going to die again now, am I not? So, or aren't I? That's how you're supposed to say that. So I can't even, like, I got a kill. This is my jam. I should start streaming this game. See. Frame rate really is everything. The moment we got to 200 frames per second, I started dropping these guys like flies. I really should be streaming this game. I think I should be very successful doing that. Look at that. Oh, somebody got me there. All right, so to around 190 frames per second. I'm going to just drop this down to the balance preset. As I said, usually people playing this game competitively, they do use a mix of basic settings and balance settings and whatnot. I'm not here to give you performance tips, as you'll be really dumb to get performance tips from me, just judging on the way I play. Now, just one thing, there is no frame generation in multiplayer, so these guys do know what's up. All right, so on the balance preset, the stuttering is quite a lot, as you can see there from the frame time graph. That's just as the game is loading in. That guy caught me by surprise. 140-ish frames per second here, not terrible, but there are quite a few stutters, and I'm not sure where they are shooting me from behind. Let's see if okay, so 140-ish frames per second here on the balanced preset, and it's actually pretty good if you want to play at native resolution and get a high refresh rate experience. Now let's just see what DLSS can do here for us. Let's see if we hit 200 frames per second here with DLSS set to quality. Alright, so 240-ish frames per second. Oh, come on. Maybe I should not stream this game. I don't think I'll get any viewers. Nope. So, at least the performance is pretty good. The game's performance, not my performance, that is. And that's why I wanted to test the campaign, rather. Okay. I really do suck. Anyway, I mean, I'm old. I'm 40 years old. I don't play competitive shooters. That's my excuse. 242 frames per second. This is probably where I'd be playing if I was going to play competitively, which I'm not for obvious reasons. And I think I'm not going to... here we go. No. That's so stupid. I'm so stupid. Okay, so let's just try 4K quickly. I forgot you can actually shoot when you are downed. That's so dumb. So let's try 4K. Let's see. I'm going to leave it on the balanced preset without DLSS. Alright, so here we are at 4K on the balanced preset in a new map. We lost that one. I really don't know how that happened at all. So, oops. Wow, they don't give you a lot of time to return to combat. So you can see that the performance over here is definitely much better than in the campaign. As I said, for obvious reasons, the maps are a lot smaller and a lot less happening on the screen most of the time. Okay, so getting around 80-ish frames per second here. This is native, right? So DLAA, and let's see. I mean, this is actually a much better area to test because it does seem to be safe over here. So 80-ish frames per second here for our average frame rate. I'm just going to enable DLSS quality here and see how much it actually improves our frame rate by. So DLSS quality. Let's see if we can get 120-ish frames per second. At 4K, that'd actually be pretty good. Okay, so 136 frames, 120 frames per second. Let's just see if it can maintain what the average is after the run here. Now, I'm not sure if there's going to be a new... Wow. Okay, there's 40. I did not stand a chance there. I mean... I'm not sure if there's going to be a new war zone for Black Ops 6 as well. Over there, the visuals would be, or the game would definitely be a lot more demanding, I'd say. See, at the moment we got 120 frames per second, we started playing much better. Although this is on a 60 Hz panel. My 4K monitor is only a 60 Hz panel, unfortunately. But we are upgrading weapons, we're getting kills, and once again, I think we should start streaming this game. Ah, see, got the HVT as well. Ah, see, all I needed was just 120 frames per second. Now I'm starting to really hurt these guys. That was terrible for me. Alright, so 133-ish frames per second. I'm not going to be... maybe we should just do one test at 1080p. Just to give you an idea, right? So I'm going to do 1080p on the extreme preset just to give you an idea what the performance is like. Alright, so on the extreme preset at 1080p, we are getting almost 200 frames per second here, which is pretty good. I don't think we need DLSS here at all to achieve a high refresh rate experience. Can I at least just kill somebody? It seems like when I'm the HVT, I really do suck. Because maybe I'm not playing it right. I don't think I'm playing it right. Anyway, so as I said, I don't really play these games at all. I haven't played any Call of Duty game. Maybe like I played DMZ for a bit with friends, and that's more PvE at times. Well, that's how we play it anyway. And but I mean, this is actually a pretty good experience here, almost 200 frames per second at 1080p on the extreme preset. And I think if we drop this down to the balanced preset, we'll be getting, as a grenade, 240 frames per second quite easily, I believe. Let's just see if I can actually kill somebody. Can you... What? Okay. I was actually quite surprised. I mean, he surprised me. They surprised me as well. All right, so let's just see last test at 1080p. I think then we'll call it. I'm just going to drop this down to the balance preset. As I said, once again, this is just to give you an idea what the performance is like. People fine-tune their settings to their liking to get as high a frame rate as possible while still maintaining decent visual so you can actually see enemies and stuff. So getting 220-ish frames per second here, and I think this is actually pretty good for those of you driving 240 Hz 1080p panels. I know that there are quite a lot of esports monitors that are 1080p 1440p 1080p 240 Hz panels, so I think this would, I expected him to run further. So I think that's going to be the end of this video. So on that disappointing note of me really sucking, I think that's going to be it. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you guys in the next one.